Thanks for joining us here on Eye on Africa, our daily look across the continent here on France 24. These are our main stories. In Democratic Republic of Congo, several promotions are announced in the armed forces, and some have raised eyebrows, including the return of a former top military aide convicted of involvement in the 2001 assassination of President Laurent-Désiré Kabila. As the 8th edition of the also known as Africa Contemporary Art Fair is underway in Paris, we welcome guest artist Cosmo White to the studio to talk about his art and the monumental installation for this year's AKA Affair. And it's semi-finals time at the Rugby World Cup here in Paris. After a mighty win over France last week, we'll look at defending world champions South Africa's chances of getting past England on Saturday. Thanks very much for joining us here on France 24. We begin in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there have been several promotions in the armed forces. Announced on national television, the reshuffle sees the return of a former top military aide who was convicted of involvement in the 2001 assassination of President Laurent-Désiré Kabila. Eddy Kapend has always denied involvement in the murder plot. This all comes ahead of December's general elections and as fresh clashes have broken out in North Kivu province between local groups and the M23 rebel movement. Aurélie Bazara-Kibangula has more from Kinshasa.
Once convicted of murder, now a high-ranking military official, Eddy Kapend is the new army commander in the Okatanga province. He was sentenced to death for his role in the assassination of President Laurent Kabila before Félix Tshisekedi granted him a presidential pardon in 2021. The military reshuffle comes a few weeks after a prominent Congolese general living in exile called on the army to stop obeying the president. General Numbi had to leave the DR Congo after he was suspected of being involved in the killing leading human rights activist Floribert Chebeya and of his driver over a decade ago. On Wednesday, President Tshisekedi reaffirmed his confidence in the army at a meeting with the military. The Congolese president recalls that the country is facing a conflict with Rwanda. He asked the military to respect their duty to defend the country. Fighting erupted in some territories in North Kivu at the beginning of October, ending several weeks of calm. The clashes are pitting local armed groups against M23 rebels. This as late last Thursday, the president announced the gradual easing of the state of siege in North Kivu and Ituri provinces.
Next up, another French military convoy is set to leave Niger in the coming days. It will mark the halfway point of the withdrawal of the 1,500-strong force as demanded by the military junta that seized power in July. Meanwhile, lawyers for the ousted president, Mohamed Bazoum, have denied claims by the junta that he had tried to escape. The military leaders said he and his family, with the help of accomplices in the security forces, had planned to flee to Nigeria. Bazoum has been held in Niamey since the 26th of July coup d'etat. Next up, the 8th edition of the also known as Africa Contemporary Art Fair event is currently underway in Paris. It's described as a conversation of contemporary art of the African diaspora. The monumental installation for this year's event is by the Jamaican-born multidisciplinary artist Cosmo White, whose works highlight the ways in which the physical spaces we occupy can either confine or empower us. And we have the pleasure of welcoming him to the studio this evening. Cosmo White, thank you very much for being with us here on
Thank you for having me. Yes.
First up, for viewers who might not know your art, African identity and immigration are central to your work. Can you elaborate a little on how you use this idea of physical spaces and Black identity?
Yes, so for a number of years now, I've been making work that has been engaging with the architecture of the site. So there have been beaded curtains that have had archival images hand-painted onto them. And in order for the viewer to see the rest of the exhibition, they have to physically walk through the artwork to then have that first image they encountered recontextualized by new works in the space.
Now, your work's obviously well known in North America and your native Caribbean. Yeah. How is it that you've come to visit us here in Paris for the AKA Fair?
So I was invited by the AKA team, particularly by Fahamu Peku. Dr. Fahamu Peku was the invited curator. And yeah, so I was asked to do this large-scale installation in the middle of the fair.
Talk to us a little bit about this installation, because it's about a conversation we read about, which is seeking to reconstruct and reclaim fragmented histories and identities that have been torn apart by colonialism and white supremacy. What have you set up here for visitors?
Yeah, so this is an interesting piece because it's a combination of two kind of archives. One is my very personal archive of my father was an architect in Jamaica, and I looked at the last set of drawings he did before he passed, and I've reinterpreted them through a sculptural lens and created these structures. And then the second archive is engaging with images of youngsters, young Black kids coming out into the streets to protest police brutality and that kind of atrocities. And this particular image is youngsters coming out to commemorate or mark the anniversary of the killing of Mike Brown. So you have the very public and the very private archives coming together in this particular piece.
And as you say, as you mentioned earlier, it's very much about physically walking through the spaces in order to experience the next one. Now, as you also mentioned, you spend a lot of time in the archives looking at the history of the African diaspora. What do you then do with all this past? Is it more of a historical look or a look forward?
Well, I feel like you can't really know where you're going without understanding, where you're coming from. And so I'm always looking to these moments in the past and trying to think about how they have shaped our present, and what can we glean from them in understanding where we want to go in the future. Yeah.
Okay. And we have, of course, as also known as Africa Art Fair. Has your art brought you physically closer to Africa? Do you have any following there, or do you have any dates planned there?
Well, interestingly enough, after this, I'm heading to the DRC. But that's not particularly related to the piece that is at Accra at the moment. But I've had great friendships and collaborations with artists who are practicing currently, whether it's South Africa or Senegal or where have you. Yeah.
So no actual art installations, no expos.
Not at the moment.
For the moment, but it's on the cards.
We'll see. Yes. Yeah.
What is next for you on the cards then?
I will have a show coming up, a group show coming up in Chicago, and then a group show in Atlanta. Yeah. So.
All to come before the end of the year, is it?
No.
Much more, much looser time.
Yeah, 2024, yes.
2024, okay,
yes,
great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, all right, well, let's leave it there for the moment then. Thank you very much. Cosmo White, a multidisciplinary artist who's, of course, the behind the monumental installation for this year's, also known as Africa Affair, currently on at the Carreau du Temple in Paris, Paris's 3rd arrondissement. That's until the 27th of October. If you can, get along and see that. And finally, let's talk sport here on Eye on Africa, because this weekend we have the semi-finals of the Rugby World Cup with defending world champions South Africa taking on England on Saturday. This comes after the Springboks overcame a mighty performance by hosts France last week, and you have to say they look the goods to go all the way. Well, we're now joined by South African journalist Thando Sibiya, who's here in Paris covering the World Cup. Thando, thanks very much for joining us tonight. All bitter feelings aside after last week's quarterfinals, it was an outstanding match from both sides, but let's be honest, South Africa are much stronger than England right now, aren't they?
Thank you so much for having me. Good evening. And we can definitely say so. The performance in the World Cup has been on an upward trajectory, and it really has been a joy to watch. I think we can say the same for New Zealand, who are winning on the other side against Argentina. So we can definitely see that it's going to be a final with New Zealand that seems to have already made it, and the decider will be made tomorrow. The rivalry between South Africa and England dates back centuries, or at least a century, and I think it is quite intense. Really looking back at the Rugby World Cup 2019 final, and England are out for blood. I think they're seeking revenge for that particular final, and also going back to the rivalry between the two countries. particularly on the rugby pitch. It's going to be a very, very interesting one. And I might bring to mention that at the same time, around about the same time tomorrow, the Proteas, which is our South African cricket team, will also be playing against England. So it is the same matchup on different terrains. And so the nation will definitely be rallying behind both teams.
As very often happens across multiple terrains, as you say. If you were part of the England coaching unit for the Rugby World Cup, what would you be telling them to do? Kick their way to the final? Could that undo the box?
It's not enough. I don't think it's sufficient. Having watched them play against France last week, I think the Springboks are a very tactical team. The coaching staff, Rassi and Jacques, and the entire coaching team, the team itself, I think they do a lot of research, and it's evident in the way they carry themselves. But it's also got a very sly element to it. It's not outward, we have done our research. And I think we've seen that unfold during this particular World Cup. It was presented in the previous World Cup, but I think this year it is becoming a lot clearer that these people are very strategic and very sly in their way. And so coming in as an English team into a match as big as this, seeing the Springboks coming hot of the heels of the kind of victory that they had managed to achieve last week against France, the host nation, in front of a very, very lively French crowd at Stade de France, and then managed to bag a victory, I think you're going to definitely have to dig deeper than that. They are a team that, like I mentioned earlier, does a lot of research, and they're going to be looking into every single thing, from which leg or which foot your kickers are using to the strengths and the weaknesses in defense. I mean, even just before the rugby match against France last week, Coach Rassi did something very interesting during the warming up, and I think that's been a talking point during this week. And he just stands there and watches the team training. And apparently this has been a tactic, entre guillemets, that he uses to perhaps intimidate the opposition, or maybe just to observe, to make the final observations, to see who's looking nervous, to see who's looking a little bit weaker. And I think those are the kinds of things, is that they just never stop feeding that information. We all know of the disco lights, which made a big brouhaha earlier in the tournament. We haven't seen those come about, but you can see that the communication that they have between each other with the team, you really have to dig deep as the opposition to the Springboks. There's a lot of confidence, there's a lot of teamwork, they back each other. And so to answer your question in short, just throwing in the kicks is not going to be sufficient for the team.
Okay, great. We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you very much for joining us, Thando Sibiya. And of course, we're looking forward to that match when England take on South Africa in the semi-final of the Rugby World Cup. That's at 9 p.m. Paris time, 1900 GMT on Saturday. And that's where we leave this edition of Eye on Africa. Thanks very much for joining us. Do remember, the international headlines are coming right up next. Do stay with us here on France 24.